Hello and welcome. I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Today's webinar is the 5 steps to the perfect storage refresh. What we're going to provide you today is an independent process for refreshing storage. Joining me to help with that conversation, I'm very excited to have Peter Murray from Virtual Instruments to help with the conversation. Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, George. Hi, everybody.
So before we jump into the meat of the webinar, just real quickly, just some logistics. All the audio is through your speakers. There is no dial-in. You can ask questions at any time by clicking on the Ask a Questions button. On-demand viewers, if we don't want you to feel left out, so if you are listening to this after the live event and have a question, just tweet us questions at Storage Swiss. Do me a favor, though, and put the hashtag perfect refresh in there, so that way we'll know kind of where you came from. We get a lot of tweets throughout the day. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, go ahead and rate today's webinar. It's a 1 to 5 star rating system. The 5 stars really help us a lot. And then there's also an area there for comments. Go ahead and put some comments in there, what you thought. Also, maybe some suggestions for other topics, things like that. We always appreciate those. So with the logistics out of the way, let's kind of give you a more formal introduction to our speakers today. So as I mentioned, Peter Murray is with Virtual Instruments. Peter, why don't you give us some quick background on you and also on Virtual Instruments?
Thanks, George. Let me talk a little about the company first, and then I'll talk about me. So Virtual Instruments actually came through a merger about a year ago between Virtual Instruments and a company called Load Dynamics. Both were started in 2008 in San Jose, California. Our headquarters are still there. Our market is really the global 2,000 customers. Virtual Instruments initially came out with a fiber channel analyzer and has developed that far beyond those capabilities. The main product now is Virtual Wisdom, which provides end-to-end infrastructure monitoring and troubleshooting. The application allows you to understand in deep level what's happening at your infrastructure, in the entire infrastructure, whether it be VMs, servers, switches, or storage, and allows you to make intelligent decisions and helps you make intelligent decisions about how to keep the infrastructure running as smoothly as possible. Load Dynamics began as a little company named SwiftTest in 2008 as well. Later we changed our name to Load Dynamics, and then we merged, and now we're all Virtual Instruments. So we began as a protocol tester for a couple of file protocols. We've consistently evolved from there. Within the first 3 years, we had all of what then were the 7 sisters, the largest storage manufacturers. We now have most of the emerging manufacturers as well, and we support infrastructure performance analytics. So what are infrastructure performance testing? So what we do, we gather information, we test to help customers make sure that they make intelligent discussion or decisions about their entire infrastructure, whether that again be VM, server, switch, and storage. I came from the SwiftTest side. I started out doing a lot of different hats. I'm now Principal SE. I do a little bit of work with the Storage Network Industry Association, or SNIA. I'm on the Solid State Storage System Tech Working Group. We call that S4 Twig, and I'm on the SNIA Technical Council as well.
Peter, thanks for that background. Appreciate that. For those that don't know me, I am George Crump, the lead analyst and founder at Storage Switzerland. Storage Switzerland is an analyst firm that's been in business for 10 years. Prior to starting Storage Switzerland, I was a CIO at a large storage integrator, and one of my key responsibilities was running a extensive test lab where we evaluated a lot of well, at that time they were startups. A lot of times now they are either name brand products that you would recognize or have been bought for billions of dollars, and I didn't get anything out of it. So the other thing is I ran tech support, which if you ever want not to have a job, that would be the one not to have. But we learned a lot in creating processes and how to help people make better decisions and plan better for the future. And you'll see some of that kind of work its way into the conversation here today. So let's talk about. I just kind of wanted to level set. Let's talk about what was a storage refresh. You know, it used to be this sort of every 3-year event. I have in there. It used to be driven by a need for more capacity. So it was like really a quantifiable thing. You just ran out of disk space. In many cases, you didn't actually run out of disk space. You got to the point where you were 60-70% full, and if it was a filer or a NAS system, you started to see performance issues, and so that kind of drove it for you. A lot of times, frankly, it also used to become a maintenance issue. The vendors would charge so much in out-year maintenance that it became cheaper just to buy a new system, right? So those are the two things. Now, what we've seen change over the past probably 4 or 5 years, but it's really heightening at its pace now, is now a lot of this is technology driven, right? And it's all about demands, right? We're seeing demand for higher and higher performance for more applications. So flash is really the thing that people look to there. We're seeing demand for higher file count. You notice I don't necessarily have capacity in there, not saying that we don't need more capacity, but that's sort of been a continual thing. What has taken people off guard is the number of files they create, and that's something that object storage happens to be good for, and so that's what we talk about. But there's, of course, always a demand to lower the cost of the storage infrastructure, and people look to the cloud to do that. And so we're almost in this nonstop refresh cycle, but the problem is that because there's no plan and there's not a specific task to think about the next refresh in most organizations, it really leads to a refresh is driven by problem arises, people get in a meeting room and yell at each other, and then they go buy a solution that they hope fixes the problem. So I call that the just throw hardware at it solution. And what we really want to talk about is the development of sort of a plan where you can really create a system that you're constantly ready for the next refresh. You know when you're going to need a new storage system or a new storage architecture or something like that. So what we're looking for is how to predict these events, because the demands are event-driven, right? And one of the challenges that we see is performance is incredibly hard to quantify, right? When somebody says, I need more performance, what does that mean? Right? Or I have people come to us all the time and say, hey, I need a 500,000 IOP flash array. Why? Well, I just do. Well, when we do some testing, we find out there's nothing in their environment that comes close to 500,000 IOPS, right? So we try to come up with ways to quantify performance. And what we really find is as you start to look at and figure out what your next storage system is going to look like, is the freeware tools and the benchmarks just don't cut it anymore, right? You can't just look at this latest benchmarks and say, okay, that, because your environment is not a benchmark, right? Your environment isn't what Iometer or some of these other tools can simulate, right? So what we need to do is come up with a way to really look at your environment, because everybody's environment is uniquely different. And so we started this kind of came from our background, frankly, in disaster recovery planning. And if you have a disaster recovery plan, the chances of you surviving a disaster go up significantly. What we wanted to do is give that same sort of thought process to a storage refresh. And so we started to work with people to develop a refresh as a practice sort of methodology. And so the first thing we want to do is understand the limits of the present technology. So before, you don't want to find out 3 weeks from now that this system is going to run out of performance. What you want to do is know whether or not it is and where that's going to be, right? So that allows you to know when the next refresh, or at least get within a range of when the next refresh is going to occur based on what your capabilities are and what the inbound workloads are starting to look like. And then finally, what we want to have start people doing is proactively test new systems in advance of their limits being reached, right? So that you know that, okay, when we hit this wall, this, system A is going to be the right way to go because it happens to solve some of these issues, right? And so that's where a a company like Virtual Instruments comes in, and I'm going to really count on Peter's expertise, because you guys have, Peter, I think you guys have this very same approach to how storage refreshes can be managed, correct?
Yes, we sure do. That's our business today. I want to talk about some of these benefits. Number one, moving to a new platform, whether it just be new storage arrays or combinations of storage arrays and switches, or a new VM solution, or expanding them, is a risky procedure. And what we want to do is to help you to test, to understand, to reduce that risk, so you can be confident that when a new system, a new structure, whatever happens to go online and is being faced by your customers, it's going to work. We want to help break the over-provisioning cycle as well. George mentioned that systems might tend to run out of horsepower when they get to 60, 70%. Well, that's true. And if that's the case, why are you buying much more than that? We found there are studies that we've seen, for example, that show that customers often buy 30 to 40% over what they're ever going to use, and you end up buying spending money for products, for the infrastructure, for the maintenance, for the electricity that never adds benefit to your company.
Yeah, and Peter, I think this over-provisioning is a big one, because without data, the typical reaction is to buy way more than you think you will ever need. Right, and unfortunately, I think what I've seen is a lot of times people are incredibly successful at that, and they do actually buy a lot more than they need. And what I always say is, look, storage is not wine. It does not get more expensive with age, right? It's the opposite of wine. It's
sure
well, I was going to say it's kind of like beer, but now with craft beer, that stuff's pretty expensive too. So it's kind of like Bud Light and Coors, right? I mean, it gets less expensive over time, and so we've got to be able to break that cycle. I think that's really critical. Now, how does talk about how a best practice can help with the speeding of deployment?
Well, knowledge is power. The more you understand about what you need, really understanding what you need by testing and seeing in a laboratory environment, the faster you can get to that deployment. You know, in the past, we would see companies, especially larger companies, demand, oh, just give me one rack of this stuff and we'll try it out. Well, that can cause its own set of problems in a storage network and doesn't really solve the problem, because you don't know necessarily when you put in that first set of the solution whether it's going to scale out where you want it to be. Secondly, if you can test, and we have the capability to now to help people do that testing that they simply couldn't do before. There wasn't time for the in-house people to be able to stand something up, try it out, see what it was going to do, and be confident about what their choice was.
Yeah,
and that kind of...
I also
Sure,
think,
go ahead.
Peter, that the other factor is, as you know, and we started to see this as an analyst firm, people would come to me and say, okay, which of these arrays can do 200 or 2 million IOPS? How do I assemble gear, you know, on a routine basis to test 2 million IOPS? That's a big ask, right?
That is a huge ask, and the vendors aren't always going to want to just give you all that gear to try it out with. But if you can measure what your applications are doing today and get a reasonable expectation of where they're going to go in the midterm, you know, the lease cycle and all that, you can at least get a representative set from the vendors and do testing, or you can talk to the vendors and have them do the testing using our equipment and confidently understand where you are and where you're going. And that feeds right into future-proofing the decision. It's pretty clear. Applications grow. You know, data grows, and that's not going to slow down any time that I can see in my lifetime. And to stay ahead of this, we want to understand not only what an application is doing today, but what it's expected to do in the future. And especially as we move into all-flash deployments. I just saw an article this week saying, hey, flash is cheaper, get over it. So yeah, okay, well, in that case, we're finding that people that implemented something for a specific application were using multi-racks of old disk-based storage arrays, full, that's a relative term. And they're finding that after implementing a flash array, they still have headroom. So there's an opportunity to perhaps consolidate applications or have that extra headroom to make sure that not only are you going to be okay, but you're going to be okay 3-4 years down the line. And lastly, by understanding how the arrays work through testing and monitoring them in production, you actually improve manageability. You can spend more time doing other work than sitting and worrying about short stroking or worrying if QDEPs are right or worrying if you've got the headroom and the capacity to go where you need to go. It can simplify all of those.
Yeah, and I think what I like here is that what you guys have done is really given us a good process that we can follow to develop this. And I'm gonna hit all these real quickly at a high level, and then we'll I know that we're gonna go into some detail as we go through. But let's talk real quickly about technology evaluation. There we're talking about Flash and NFS and iSCSI, all the different sort of protocols. I guess here it's trying to figure out what protocol makes the most sense for you, right?
Yes, it's a combination of protocols and technology. For example, a lot of the vendors are saying, well, hey, you can implement the stuff that you're using on Fiber Channel today, you can implement that on iSCSI. You may want to implement it on an NFS or SMB. Well, okay. Well, let's check and see if that's going to work by using a realistic workload. People are talking about whether you really need Flash. Well, there's a good way to test it. Flash, all disk for cold storage perhaps, a hybrid for other apps, or all Flash, and in another couple of years we're going to be looking at NVMe as well. And you want to clearly understand, if I've got a really fast cache essentially and then slower data, how often in the business cycle am I going to be going back to that older data? Because even a 5% cache miss can effectively double the latency of an application.
Yeah, and I think that's something that really takes people off guard, is what is the impact of a cache miss and how do you test for that? So that's a really good one to point out. Now, the next one is so I guess the first step here is figure out what protocol and what access method makes the most sense, and then we get into understanding specific products, correct?
Yes, exactly right. And evaluating the products is your best guide to how they're going to work in production. And being able to do that across the platforms that you're considering can give you an actual measurable performance. It also can benefit your vendor as well. Sometimes products are sent out for evaluation and they're not quite tuned up to where they should be. And that's, no fault. We can't always know what application and what the deployment is going to look like. So by doing that product evaluation, number one, you can see what the product's going to do. And if you do run into problems, you can also talk to your vendor and see whether that's a product limitation or just something related to configuration. So once you know that, you've got a much better idea of what to choose. And this is not only for your storage. You can test using our products. You can also test to make sure that the network is adequate, the products you're using are adequate, and they're tuned properly, all the way up to the VM infrastructure. VM licenses can be very expensive, and it's important to optimize your deployment to make sure that you're not buying too much or too little.
Yeah, exactly. So then after that, I think the next key is, and I like this one because it talks about, this kind of gets us into that optimization mode, right? And here we can look at, should I use tiering? Should I use caching? How much caching should I use? What's our mix of solid state and hard drives, if that makes sense? Those sort of things, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And even when you have an all-flash array, there's cache going on there, and you want to make sure that if that is tunable, that you can do that. If you're tearing among different technologies, to test for that. One classic that we see is setting for Fiber Channel, getting an appropriate queue depth. And this is my observation. I'll say it, that queue depths often are set too high rather than too low. And by getting that optimum level, by testing and seeing it in production, knowing where you're going to get the performance, you can solve a lot of heartache.
Yeah, I agree with you on QDEP. QDEP seems to be the shortcut solution sometimes that causes as many problems as it creates. And then I think the next one is talk about production performance and availability management. How does that fit into the refresh component?
Well, this kind of brings in the virtual wisdom side of the house. By monitoring regularly, by understanding what's going on in your infrastructure, and I don't want to even say network, because it's VM servers, switches, and storage. By understanding that as best as you can and optimizing that network continuously, you're going to have a good view of how things are going. You're going to get an advance warning of when it's time to start thinking about another product or different technology. It can help you to make those decisions with a lot more confidence.
Exactly. And then finally, of course, filling in the puzzle here is change impact analysis, which I think, hit twice, which I think is really critical for this whole process. So talk a little bit about change impact analysis.
Sure. During the operation of an application, things are going to change. You're likely to see increasing in traffic. You're likely to see different performance variations that happen in the storage, in the VMs, and in the network. You may find that you have a whole lot of headroom and that you can consolidate multiple applications onto an array. This is becoming increasingly common. You may find that your application is growing at a level and you know that you can get that performance out of it. There's more performance because you've seen it in the lab. Well, you can do some testing, do some what-if scenarios to make sure that you're getting all that you can out of that existing solution and to know when it's time to go on to the next technology evaluation. This is a continuous process.
Exactly. So that was sort of a high-level overview of these 5 components. Let's pick a couple areas here that we should dive in on. So we talked about this technology evaluation component. And obviously, a lot of times when you're refreshing a storage solution, you're also looking to see if a different protocol makes more sense, or I guess in some cases, Peter, it's, hey, does this protocol do just as good and it's cheaper? Those things come into the evaluation picture as well, correct?
Certainly does. If you're, just because your switching infrastructure is less expensive doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change access methods. Just because you've heard great stories about being able to migrate to the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right place for all of your applications. And it will set aside things like security and other things like that. It just can be performance issues. We're getting to a new world, especially with Internet of Things, where we're doing constant monitoring, constant sensors, things like that. There could just be not enough bandwidth to do everything in the cloud or do things across a network. It may require more local resources, and it's important that you have those resources placed where they're needed to get the performance that's required. So this is a very high payback can bring you, but there's a lot of risk in understanding how to do that.
And then, so understanding those two ends of the axle, I think, is really critical. Understanding what the payback is, but then comparing that against the risk and knowing so you can make the right decision, right?
Yeah.
So then let's kind of dive deep again on, and I think this is an area where people tend to get focused in on, right? And I think it's one of the things I wanted to point out as we went through this is notice, guys, that this is only 1/5 of the puzzle, right? That product evaluation is just one part. And ironically, though, it's still something that we tend to lack the right tools to do testing with. Is that right, Peter?
So often, this is the focus of the refresh without considering other factors. And a lot of times, I know I've been doing this for a while. I came from the networking industry where evaluation was done by spreadsheet based upon vendor specs. And you know what? The vendor doesn't have your apps or your environment. They make their best guess. They got a lot of smart people, but understanding directly is the only way that you're going to see what's going to give you the best product at the price you can afford with enough headroom to allow it to move forward into the future. You want to do this with your own applications, or I should say, testing using a model of your application to as closely as possible model what's going on, not only on a normal day, but what happens at the end of the month when you're doing billing, what happens when you're doing quarterly close, what happens when you're doing data mining, things like that, that all add different levels of stress to that total data, the data center environment. And by doing this, testing with your own applications, you can get a lot clearer idea of how any one particular solution or combination of solutions is going to meet your needs.
Yeah, exactly correct. And I think that's one of the things we'll show you, because I'm thinking as a viewer also, is that okay, that sounds great, so I just got to recreate my entire data center, right? Well, don't have to do that. We're going to talk about ways that you can get the exact same results without having to recreate your entire data center. So
right.
Now the other one, and I think this is one that's, for me, it's my pet peeve, because I think it's one that people really overlook, is really optimizing the configuration. And I think it ties nicely into evaluation, because if you know how to optimize the configuration, that will impact what you evaluate. You might not need that super fast all-flash array. You could get away maybe with a hybrid system with cache or something of that nature, correct?
Yes, and even more important, you've made your selection, you start doing things, and the config doesn't necessarily work as you thought it should. Well, in the past, that would mean usually getting a bunch of people in the room with each person pointing to their right and saying it's his problem. And these could involve months-long reviews and solutions trying to find the problem, and it may not be found even then. So by understanding and testing and doing this with a subset of your infrastructure in a lab, you don't need to recreate the entire data center. You can recreate a portion of it, be able to test different types of things to make sure that it's running as expected and that it's going to deliver what has been promised.
Exactly. And then this one I like, because I just like the word proactive, because anytime I can do something proactive, I feel like it's a good day, right? But I think the key here is to be able to, and you have a bullet there on it, but be able to model fixes to solutions in your lab instead of, just, again, this gets back to the throw hardware at it, throw software at it, throw anything at it just to get people off your back. It's better to do that in a test environment, right?
The better view that you have of your infrastructure, the more intelligently you can decide what to do about that, whether that be tuning, replacement, changing apps, whatever it might be, and how you deploy them as well, as we talked going into the cloud. Now, these surprises occur. Sometimes the estimated use application use is underestimated, and when it actually goes online, something becomes very popular and puts more stress on the infrastructure. Some people say, well, we trust our vendor, so we don't do local testing. Well, in fact, you do. You either test in a lab or you test in production. And testing in production can be a very painful and costly experience. By testing in your lab, understanding what's going on, you have a much better chance of success.
Yep, exactly. And then I think the final piece is also something that's really an interesting component to the storage refresh concept, right? Is that understanding, what impact change will have on the environment is also critical, correct?
Yeah, software vendors, switch vendors, VM vendors, everybody, and application vendors are doing updates. They're doing this regularly, and dropping something in, saying, okay, well, we'll do the storage upgrade, can be a little bit painful experience. You want to make sure you don't have any regressions. You want to make sure in your switching environment that you're getting the performance and again, not getting regressions. Same thing with the VMs. The more you know and the more you can test ahead of time, this can be a fairly simple procedure. Just dump something in, check and make sure that nothing's going backwards, and move on to something new. And when you find something, have the conversation with your vendor to make sure that it's not just a configuration issue, make sure that it is something real, and perhaps delay those deployments, the updates, until you're confident that they're going to do what's expected.
exactly. So, I think we've given people a good overview here. Let's talk a little bit more specifics because, again, going to that idea of where that I don't have to recreate my entire data center. So let's talk about this concept of workload analysis and modeling.
Certainly, thank you. I'm going to start over on the left-hand side of the screen. I know our primary focus today is on load dynamics, but I also want to take a couple of moments to talk about Virtual Wisdom. Virtual Wisdom supports Fiber Channel today and NFS version 3. More protocols are coming where this solution can be dropped right into your network, your existing network. You can monitor, of course you can monitor different parts of the network, the VMs, the servers, the switches, and the storage. But even better, you can model using Virtual Wisdom with wire data. Wire data is the truth. The better you understand what's going on now and trends that are occurring in the network, the better you can keep ahead of potential problems and keep the network running smoothly. We've got customers that are running at 85% of capacity day in, day out with confidence that what they're doing is working. And when problems do appear, they have a great view into what needs to be done to solve those problems. Now, that's the monitoring side. And now I'm going to talk about the testing side. You can get information from Virtual Wisdom from that wire data. If you're haven't deployed Virtual Wisdom yet, you can also use something that we call the Workload Data Importer that pulls statistics from essentially any array. Will give some sort of performance statistics. Some are better, but they typically all give you enough information that you can use to take that information, usually in a CSV file, to create a model, and from that model to view what's happening, to create a test from it, and then to be able to regenerate that test or combination of tests for multiple applications in your lab using our workload generation appliance. That workload generation appliance is not like Iometer, FIO, VDBench, anything like that. This is the most powerful solution in the industry. It's optimized for testing. It is not only extremely high performance, it's very repeatable and very accurate. So instead of standing up a rack of whatever servers you have left over or some VM infrastructure, a single appliance can allow you to use that for modeling. Now, workload acquisition is something I mentioned quickly, but I want to go through in a little more detail. So acquiring the workload, as I said, can come from the Virtual Wisdom data, or it can come from your own performance statistics. We take that information from that CSV file for the duration of the model, and we run that through a platform that provides us information. Let's take a look at that. From that, we get the workload analysis. So you can see on the screen here, we get information about the 3 key performance indicators, which are throughput, IOPS, and latency. We also get errors information as well. Now also on the screen, you can see that we do a read-write mix, we do a command mix, we show request size distribution. I love, a lot of times you look at performance statistics and they say, your average IOP was 37K. Well, we know there's no 37K IOP. They're a combination, and this gives an accurate view as to what was actually seen during that recording period. We can tell you the latency versus the request size. We can show latency versus IOPS, all this information from the screen. And then we can go into a little bit more detail as well by looking at individual test screens that show, in this case, you see IOPS. We have them also for latency. We have them for throughput. And you can look at these and see what happened over time. This may be part of a day, this may be multiple days. You can see where the peaks are, you can see where the valleys are, and then you can take this information and use that to generate a workload. One additional thing, some larger customers also tend to want to go with looking at corners testing. So you can do this. We have a very easy way to set up testing with multiple parameters, multiple comparisons. We just start the test and it runs. So you can see, hey, what's going to happen if my workload increases by 4x over the next 3 years. You can see what-if simulations to see what happens if I combine, things like that. There we go.
And Peter, I would think that workload monitoring really becomes a big deal when you start looking at things like, we were talking about being proactive and knowing when if you will, the wall is coming. That what-if capability really gives you that visibility, correct?
Yeah, it's going to give you the corners of the performance of the array. By combining that with your recorded information, you can get a much clearer view of where you're going.
So let's throw up our first polling question here. Down at the bottom of your player should be a place for you to vote. Does your organization analyze and model application workload profiles before you start your storage refresh project? So A, no, we rely on our vendor to figure this out. No, we rely on the VAR or integrator to figure it out. C, yes, we utilize vendor-supplied open source tools. Or yes, we use professional products like those from Virtual Instruments. Voting is kind of even right now, Peter, between the top three. Not a big surprise there. I think the open source tools, there it goes. The open source tools would be the thing that I would have seen the most. So about half of the attendance is using some sort of open source tools. I don't think we talk a lot about open source in this presentation. I know I've written a paper on it in the past, some of the challenges with it. What's your take on some of the open source tools?
There's one open source tool out there, in my opinion, that can give you meaningful information. That's VDBench, but you better know how to use it. It's a non-trivial system to program, to create the test that you want. And some of the features that I believe are most important are rarely used. For example, sub-second bursts. This is one area where it's really critical to understand. If we can say that we're talking to a LUN, for example, and it's getting 100 IOPS, well, a lot of those solutions will give you 100 IOPS evenly metered over a second, when in reality, a computer doesn't slow down. It tries to get rid of something it needs to send as quickly as it can. So you do get a burst, and those sub-second bursts tend to cause the queues to fill and cause more work for the CPUs. And you see, in fact, larger latency and a little bit lower performance when those things happen. When you start combining them with multiple applications, it can be a significant issue. So although the rest of the benchmarks, the rest of the traditional disk testing solutions, in my opinion, don't tell you what you need to know.
Yeah, a lot of times they just give you a raw number, which is not really based in reality. So we'll leave the poll open for a little bit, but right now about 57% of the people have voted for using open source tools. Also, to kind of help with a follow-on to Peter's comment there, if you go to our website, storageswiss.com, and search for VDBench, you'll get a piece that we wrote that kind of talks about the pros and cons of VDBench, that talks specifically about some of the controls that Peter mentioned, and then probably most importantly, some of the shortcomings of using it. If you're listening on demand, we'll have added as an attachment. So, Peter, back to you with kind of wrapping up on this.
Thank you. So now I just want to take a few minutes here and show you information about real-world implementation. We've been talking theory. Now here's a couple examples from our customers where we've been able to help them. You've probably heard of GoDaddy, world's largest web registry and big web hosting environment. A few years back, they were trying to determine the most effective way to move forward. They got up to 31 petabytes, growing 30% with 5 nines uptime across 5 data centers. They had done some testing previously using open source tools and had some problems that became actually very visible. And so they were tasked to go back and do testing based upon more realistic workload modeling and testing. So they modeled their current workloads, and then they tested those with what if if they grew over a certain amount over a certain time. So working with those do-it-yourself tools they not only hadn't helped to emulate them, they missed some pretty big failures. So by using us, the storage costs were reduced. You see here 60% over 2 years. They had the confidence that not only was the initial implementation going to work, but that implementation over the life of that particular infrastructure was going to continue to work, and it gave them freedom to spend more time innovating. This is a key piece. Rather than chasing problems all the time, it gave them the chance to actually look ahead and model. They were able to test in ways that they simply couldn't do without our tools. And as Julia Palmer here, Julia has now moved on to Gartner Group, but at the time she was in charge of all this. Her comment was that virtual instrument is like my smartphone. I can't imagine life without it. And she said she couldn't even see the need for the tools before. There was a talk she gave at SNIA a few years ago, and said once she had it, you couldn't pry it out of her hands. That she really found that the load dynamic solution did the job. Next is we'll say a large bank infrastructure was doing a refresh. They wanted to know the best price performance for Flash. They were planning already to move forward, and they wanted it not only to meet their current needs, but what they expected. So they modeled their current workloads and then used a 5x accelerator. In other words, taking the current load and ramping it up to 5x. That's a very simple process with our tools. It's essentially just dialing up the load. If necessary, we can spread across multiple appliances, but it's rarely the case. So they went ahead to check the headroom of all these various appliance solutions. And no, we didn't recreate the entire data center. Found a representative performance envelope from each of those by testing arrays in the lab, and were able to extrapolate from that. So Load Dynamics Enterprise is what we use to help these customers make this multi-million-dollar decision. If you're spending $1 million or more, the first implementation that you use to test us can save more than what it would cost for our product. By right-sizing it, you can do that. So they were able to test and make the best decision to select the best array. They did 1x and 5x loads, and we're confident where they were heading. Let's take just a moment and look at that in a little bit more detail. So there was actually a lot of variation in the 5 different devices, the 5 different arrays that they tested, and they were able to find that. In this case, we're looking at latency, but also remember we can get throughput and IOPS values as well. And then they were able to make a much better decision based upon price performance. You can see their current product and product C were about the same. Product F was slightly more, and it was the lowest cost. Product A was the highest performance, but boy, was it more expensive. They ended up selecting product B, and with the confidence to help them know that what they were doing was going to work. We've got another case study here from Nationwide. They were looking at replacing their NAS systems. A new array was proposed by their vendor. They wanted to make sure that this was going to work because it was a completely new product and they'd never been able to test it. So we wanted to find the exact configuration to do the current workload and to do the 4x workload on there. So we used Enterprise to do this and to help them propose the optimum configuration. It was less than what the vendor proposed, but it was they were making that decision knowing that they weren't going to be wasting array dollars, they weren't going to be wasting money where they didn't need to, significantly lowered their costs, and as you can see here on the quote, by using virtual instruments, our normal testing cycle was reduced from 2 months to 2 weeks. And then thirdly, Geico is on the monitoring side of our solution. But again, important because we can pull those monitoring statistics when it comes time to think about a refresh. So they were having performance issues. These were financial and customer support applications, very visible, very high-cost applications, and they didn't have the visibility to test them. Virtual Wisdom was brought into the data center to ensure that they could get 100% uptime and the proper configuration. They use taps. We have the capability of installing a tap which we steal 10% of the light. It's about the equivalent of a patch. We find that when we do these deployments, not only do we not reduce performance or cause problems, we often fix them. You would be surprised how many fiber optics cables come from the vendor and are just not ready for prime time. So by using our services, we were able to install, get these things into the network. They literally eliminated performance issues using Virtual Wisdom's end-to-end performance, the metrics and analytics. You know, you get application managers tell you information about the application, but they don't tell you anything about the infrastructure performance below that. And that's where we play. We tell you everything about what's going on and how to tune and remedy problems in the network. So now they've got sub-second latency metrics for proactive detection of their problems, the end-to-end view of the storage environment and the compute environment, and real-time root cause identification. We have excellent analytics and very advanced applications that help to identify and recommend solutions. Okay, I'm going to move on here, and I think I'm waiting for a response, sorry. One more time. There we go. Last one, PayPal. PayPal, like many companies, was testing in production. They wanted to de-risk, they wanted to make sure that everything they updated, whether it was a storage array, a firmware, VM, was going to work before it went in. So they test all new releases now in their lab doing pre-deployment. They don't use the production systems. This completely ended the surprises that they're getting with software releases. As I say, before VI, the latest storage upgrade would have been an all-hands-on-deck call-out, and my team would have been severely criticized for what could have been interpreted as a real problem. They solved a lot of those problems. So, George, would you like me to summarize?
So, I think that this gives us a really good break point, right? I think that what we've shown here is that you can develop a process for doing a storage refresh, and if you go through these components, you can get there without, again, having to recreate your entire data center. And so I think there's a lot of value in what we have here. Let's also go ahead and take the next polling question. But before we do that, let's look at the results from the last one. So I think what's good about this, Peter, is only 11% counted on their vendors, which is good. Not that vendors have ulterior motives or anything like that, but they have a myopic view of the world, right? So I'm okay if you're going to count on your VAR. That's an upgrade. I'm a little concerned that so many people count on open source tools, and I get why you would do that, but I think that article and some of the conversation we've had thus far will hopefully give you some ideas why you should. If you have more questions about that, click on the Ask a Question button, and Peter and I can go into some detail. And then we had a few people say they're using your guys' product, so you have a couple of fans out there as well, so that's all good. And then
always
as far
as
the next one, let's talk about, okay, so now you've heard some things. Let's talk about what your next storage refresh looks like. Your choices here for your next storage refresh, I plan to conduct a head-to-head comparison between vendors or technologies. I purchase directly from the preferred vendor without validating. Or option C is you're just not sure yet and we have some more work to do. So we'll let those come in. I'm thinking that we're going to get a lot of A, hopefully, if we did our job right, Peter.
I hope so.
So while we're letting those come in, so before we get to your questions, like I said, click on the Ask a Question button if you have a question for Peter or I, especially if you have something specific on either VD Bench or Iometer or any of those other open source tools, or any tools in particular. We'll try to help you out where we can. If you want a on-demand version of this webinar, it'll be available about 5 minutes after the webcast is complete. The same URL works in both cases, so that's always a good thing. The other thing I wanted to point out is in the upper right-hand part of your browser, there's a green button that says Share with your team. So if you thought that this was valuable, if you've got some other people in the organization that kind of need to listen to this message, feel free to send them an email. I can't give you anything for that, but I hear that like the rest of your day goes really, really well. So I can't verify that, but that's what I've heard. So you might want to click on that and send it to somebody. In fact, I've heard the more people you send it to, the better your day gets. So there's some kind of correlation there. And then finally, in the attachment section, there's all kinds of links to different reports and articles that kind of go through these different subjects that we've been talking about. I, of course, have gotten a question about, hey, can I get a copy of this presentation? Answer is yes. We've uploaded the PDF. I'll warn you, it's a little big, 3.8 megs. So it's there if you want to download it, and then there's all the different links available to you as well. So, Peter, are you up for a few questions?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer.
Okay. So here's the first one. Do the load dynamics products work with all storage products from all vendors?
Thanks for that question. Absolutely. We monitor and test storage protocols. We do this in a vendor-independent way. Wire data is the real deal, and having that is, in my opinion, for monitoring, the most important piece. If you're testing using a vendor-supplied test kit, just be aware that that test was set up, first of all, of course, to make their product look as good as it possibly could. In some cases, it also is a way to prevent another vendor from getting in, because the test methodology may prefer their solution over another. So we're the only independent voice, in my opinion, out there.
And just to kind of add into that, there's also a lot of vendors are really starting to count on you guys as sort of their primary testing tool. And you probably can't name names, but as I recall, there's a fair number of vendors that are using you guys as their primary testing tool as well, right?
Yes, they are. In fact, the majority of vendors are using us because we're the best. We give the best answers. We give the deeper insight. People are able to get information out of us that they simply can't get elsewhere.
Good. So here's another question that came in, Peter. I'll let you start, and then I'll kind of wrap it. But I think everybody, we both want to probably have a comment here. What's wrong with Iometer?
Iometer was designed as a disk testing tool. It wasn't even designed for use in networks. Iometer will let you look at random or sequential testing. They'll let you do different mixes of reading and writing. They don't do microbursts. That to me is a critical mistake, because those microbursts, especially as traffic increases, can have a strong effect. Secondly, they don't model applications. And applications don't behave like the monitoring that you're doing with Iometer. Now, there are hotspots. There's the drift of those hotspots. What this means is that your applications actually have narrow bands that get more frequently accessed than others, and they move over time. As data gets older, it becomes stale and it gets accessed less frequently. And Iometer just doesn't let you set up those types of cases to show what the application is going to look like. It'll give you a basic corners test. Yeah, how much read and how much write do I get? Well, that's fine, but if you're running multiple applications on that array, it's going to have peaks and valleys during that time. You want to be able to test using that spatial and temporal locality. We want to know what happened, where, when, and test for that rather than testing blind I/O. And I don't mean to denigrate it. It was a great tool when it came out, but the world has moved on, and that's pretty much true for any of the other tests that are just doing read, write, mix, things like that. One other advantage that I'll say quickly about load dynamics is we have patent pending algorithms for testing random data and for testing compressible data. And by combining those with a certain number of exclusively or unique objects, we can really model what the network looks like. So we can test, the storage application looks like. We can test with the dedupability, compressibility values that you just can't get with other tools.
Yeah, that's an important one as more and more systems start to offer dedupe as sort of a primary feature, right?
Yes, absolutely. It can really help you to reduce costs, but you better understand how it works and whether it's giving you what you expect.
So another question here, Peter, is, they kind of cheated. They asked 2 questions in one question box, so we'll take them one at a time here. Can I engage you guys or the product as a service for my storage refresh, or do I need to purchase it outright?
Certainly you can engage with us. In fact, that's how many customers begin with us. They've got a project coming up, they want to test for it, they're not certain whether they can afford us. So they do that. We will come in. We have a superb professional services team that can help model the application, test against whether it be a bake-off or test for capabilities by consolidating applications and doing those in a way that can really give you confidence about your decision. And we can do this in a week or 2. This is opposed to trying to do it in-house. A lot of architects and administrators spend a lot of time running around fine-tuning their networks, and they simply don't have time to think about the bigger picture. And let's face it, storage testing is not a simple process. There are simplified tools, but if you want a real answer, having us in can do that. So yeah, professional services can be an excellent start.
Okay. And then kind of that segues well into the second part of the person's question. If I purchase, what more can I or my company do beyond the assess and validate storage performance and purchase decisions?
Well, as we said earlier, it's not just your storage arrays that drive your performance. It's a combination of your servers, your VMs, your network infrastructure. And load dynamics, again, gives you a way to emulate the VMs. It gives you a way to test using real application models to test the network and to test the storage. From the standpoint of the VM stack and all that, by using virtual wisdom, you can get a much better idea of what's going on. We have intelligent or advanced software that will do things such as rebalance your queue depths. We can also rebalance your VMs. If you've got one that's turned out to be a resource hog in a particular cluster and you've got multiple clusters, we can provide answers or even do the move for you to rebalance those VMs to make sure that they're going to be running as they should, where they should. When problems arise, we've got that monitoring solution to tell you where they are so you can proactively decide where to apply the remedy. It's not always going to be in the array. It's not always going to be in the switch, nor is it always going to be in the VM infrastructure. So we can help you pinpoint that and solve the problem where it exists.
Okay. So I also want to put everybody's contact information up on the screen. So you can reach out to us. Storage Switzerland's contact information is on the left-hand side of the screen, and the virtual instruments contact information is on the right-hand side of the screen. And Peter, we are at the top of the hour, so we should probably try to let it go at that point. So thank you very much for helping with today's conversation and showing people sort of a process to do a storage refresh.
George, it's a pleasure to work with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
No problem at all. And of course, I want to thank all of you for attending today. We had really good attendance, so we appreciate it. Again, if you know anybody that could benefit from this webinar, go ahead and click on that email button and send them a link to it. It means more than probably coming from us. But for now, though, I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Have a great day.